This is Questions with Alena Tribushnaya. We're joined by Garry Kasparov, a politician, a world chess champion, and one of the key public critics of Putin in the world. Hello, Garry. Hello. Thank you for joining us today. I would like to start with a question that serious journalist wouldn't ask a serious politician in the world that works under proper rules. But the world cracked and my country is bombed. That's why I would like to ask this question. Why, looking at what's going on today and what Putin is doing with Ukraine, the United States wouldn't recognize Russia as a terrorist country, and this person who is hiding in the bunker and it's not clear, maybe he's mad and threatening the world. Why wouldn't they liquidate him as liquidated Hussein or Gaddafi? The answer to this question is quite obvious. Putin has nuclear weapons. But I think before we get to this extreme point, liquidation, a lot of things could have been done, and they still can be done, that would help Ukraine to win the war and save the world from further threats that are coming from this maniac who is hiding in the bunker. I think the problem is that Americans simply don't know what to do in this situation. They don't have a strategy. In fact, what you said, this is a realization of a plan. But there is no plan. Neither Americans nor NATO can decide what is the purpose of war in Ukraine, to save Ukraine or to win the war. Sanctions are for Ukraine kind of to sustain and to punish Putin for aggression, or the purpose of sanctions is to finally break the back of Putin's military machine. These questions don't have answer yet, and I'm not expecting those answers tomorrow, yet I'm writing about it all the time. So therefore it's very hard to speak about some realization of these plans. Yes, NATO helps, gives support, some countries more, some countries less, but so far Ukraine doesn't give enough military support in order to finally win the war. Biden was in Warsaw, and he said that this man, meaning Putin, can't rule Russia anymore, can't be in power anymore, and the whole Department of State was apologizing for him, saying that he was misunderstood. Was it some sort of kind of indirect threat to the Kremlin, or it was a slip of the tongue that the White House was kind of regretting about? You know, knowing Biden and knowing his previous statements, I would say that Biden is sincere. He is a man of the Cold War. He knows what the Soviet Union was. And I think after talking to Ukrainian refugees and actually touching directly those horrors of the war, I think he was sincere saying what he said. The problem is that Biden's White House and his whole administration, they were horrified because it meant that they had to make steps and actions. And you know, they don't have to seize Putin's bunker, but they need to understand the goals of the war, and they need to help Ukraine to win the war. And actually, they need to make sure that sanctions are not only to punish Putin for the aggression, but sanctions will sustain until Putin's troops are in Ukraine and in the Crimea included. This military sanction package is for stopping Putin, to stop Putin threatening all other countries. That's why they're maneuvering. And one of the problems that I encounter today, this is what's going to happen if Putin's regime collapses. It's hard to believe, but I remember 1991 and President Bush's speech in Kiev, so-called Chicken Kiev speech, when he was warning the Ukrainians about nationalism and leaving the Soviet Union. And today we see the same. Biden's administration is in panic, you know, seeing what's going to happen if Putin's regime collapses and this chaos that will come after that. And naturally, this regime that we have today in Russia, this is the main terrorist threat for all humanity. So how to understand it properly? They didn't make this decision because they're scared or because they don't know what is more beneficial for them. For us, Ukraine, to win, or for Russia to kind of being busy with us in this war. I suspect that they don't know the answer themselves, and looking at their actions and statements, I would say that there is a struggle of different positions. And of course, we hear all this talks about unity of NATO, but there is no unity. There is no unity because there is no leadership. There is no American leadership. There is no Harry Truman who built the concept of confronting the communism, and he stopped it in 1940s. And there is no Reagan, President Reagan, who said it's empire of evil. Now they're comparing Reagan's words with Biden's words, but Reagan didn't shift to the reverse gear, you know. And the Department of State wasn't worrying about this. In other words, there is no this political line, this political trend that would be looking into the future, those who would be taking responsibility for what's going to change our future. We are dealing here with weak people who are not ready for this historical mission. That's why they're fidgeting. They understand that they need to help Ukraine. And they are helping, and they actually introduced such sanctions that nobody would even think of. If 2 months ago they were told that these sanctions will be introduced, they would be laughing. But they had to do it because they have to submit to the public opinion. In America, more than 60% they think that administration doesn't do enough to support Ukraine, and this is a clear indicator of the moods in America and in democratic Europe. But there is a certain gap between the demands of the public and desire to help Ukraine in full, and the politicians who are always trying to weigh their next step. What's going to happen if there will be escalation? What's going to happen if Putin will use chemical weapons? And here there is a lot of room for speculations, and these speculations stop them from making proper decisions. So, but in the Kremlin, how they perceive that? Do they perceive it as a weakness? Oh, of course, absolutely. It's not even a question. It's not a question of Putin only. We know all the dictators, as we know from history books, they were always inspired by the weakness of their opponents. Hitler in 1930s, he didn't think about the global war, I think, because he was afraid of England and France's response, and only the surrendering position of the Western countries inspired him to start the war. But when he was attacking Poland, he didn't think that England and France will be engaged in the war, and that will be the world war. A dictator always bluffs. They are ready to move forward if they think that there's not going to be an adequate response. And no doubt that the aggression that started in 2014 against Ukraine, it's of course the result of surrendering position of Westerners and America. If all those sanctions were imposed by Obama in 2014, Ukraine wouldn't be facing such a horrible humanitarian catastrophe. If American weapons would be delivered to Ukraine in full, and some sanctions were imposed 6 months ago, most probably it would stop Putin from crossing the borderline on 24th of February. Unfortunately, nothing of that was done, and everything that's happening today is spontaneous, as a reaction to Putin's actions and those constant statements of officials in the US. They're saying, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do that, we're not going to respond if even Putin uses weapons of mass destruction in Ukraine. And of course, all this inspires Putin, and mainly it gives his generals a sense of impunity. If they try to do that, then they need to understand that any unit or any battleship that would use these weapons of mass destruction would be immediately destroyed. And we can see if any of them would like to make this suicidal step. But we don't see anyone who would let them do that. But if you and I understand that the more you let dictator go forward, the more they do. You know, probably Scholz, Sullivan, and Blinken, they understand it too. So then why they kind of hiding from it, and they don't want to think that Poland could be next, then the Baltic countries, then Germany. You know, in Germany they started talking about some sort of iron dome because they're afraid of they can be shot at from Kaliningrad. So something must be done to stop the dictator. So the problem is in leadership, right? Yes, absolutely. We have to understand the decisions we make today and decisions to be make tomorrow. There is a difference. Weak politicians always postpone their decisions. We can have different categories of politicians. Scholz actually did more than you could expect from him. Germany doesn't have real weapons, but Germany is leading European sanctions campaign with the backdrop of a surrendering position of French President Macron. Poland and Baltic countries, they act absolutely differently than Hungary does. But in fact, it all boils down to the United States, because NATO today, it is the United States, and American unpreparedness and Biden's unpreparedness to take historical responsibility actually pushes Putin to continue his aggression. And I don't understand what is the principal difference for NATO to encounter Putin's military machine in Poland or in Ukraine if NATO is afraid of this confrontation a priori. When we hear these talks that it's impossible that NATO should be engaged in the conflict because Putin may use weapons of mass destruction, but nevertheless we will be protecting NATO countries, every inch of their territory. But listen, NATO will be attacked not by Martians, but Putin's troops. Besides, there is a whole number of ways to actually harm NATO countries without crossing the border. And God forbid, for example, a missile with a chemical weapon would explode like 500 meters from the Polish border. Is it attack on NATO countries or not? And I'm sure there will be some NATO officials that will be measuring the distance between the border and the explosion. Yet there will be a number of citizens in Poland will be harmed by this explosion. So this confrontation is inevitable, and what we deal today with, this is the lack of political will and complete unreadiness to make those historical decisions. Though on the other hand, they should be considered as a window of opportunities, because Ukraine proved them that the devil is not as scary as they imagined, since Ukrainian army is fighting this one of the strongest armies for a whole month, and probably this is the historical moment to actually use it and do it, and finally deal with the guy that Americans are trying to democratize for so many years. Well, here you're touching on a very big subject, and the topic is how globalization process influenced global policy. In fact, the myth that through trade and open relationship you can democratize such countries as Russia, China, and Iran. This myth is destroyed. But in fact, we got the opposite. Russia is not importing liberal values, but exporting corruption, using corruptibility of the West. And this is the problem we're dealing with today, because Putin's agents and lobbyists across the world, they had an incredible influence. Therefore, he was able to write off all his crimes because this work was done. Many leading Western politicians are openly working for him, and many businessmen are working for him, and some of the entertainment industry. So this work never stopped, even today. When we are talking about this and things are obvious, nevertheless, in American press and in European press, you can hear some voices who are saying, yes, we need to find some form of compromise. We can't make Ukraine fight this war and die in this war, but Ukraine is not going to surrender. But you know, all those people, they're saying, so we need to find a way. Maybe we need to make some concessions with Putin. His propaganda works. Today, for example, I saw this fake news about how Russian captives were shot, but it's not true. But those bots in Twitter, they are spreading this information, so the work is done, this propaganda work is done. But as you said, the Ukrainian army showed that Putin's war machine is hoax. It's possible to fight it and to defeat it. And everything you need is quality weapons for that. But, you know, to have this optimistic note in our talk, I know that weapons are coming to Ukraine from NATO countries. NATO is one organization, but different countries are members of it. And I think Ukraine will get more and more weapons. But this is not a result of stronger decisiveness of Western politicians. This is because they're submitting to the public opinion, and they're more on Ukrainian side because Ukraine is successfully fighting. I couldn't even imagine that some of the leading American channels will be showing maps of other countries with military operations and where they're explaining where the troops go. In fact, this topic is dominating in people's mind in the US, and the trend is going slower than we would expect, and Ukraine pays a horrible price for this surrendering position of Western politicians, but every day changes the situation to our benefit. I'm saying to our benefit because more and more people here say that war in Ukraine, this is a war of civilization with barbarianism and totalitarianism, and Ukraine is on the front line of this war. And victory or loss in this war is not a question of survival and sovereignty of Ukraine. It's actually where the whole world is going to go. Are we going to break this totalitarian trend that's been built for the last 15 years, or we are going to be still under this power of darkness? So we'll have to win and be leaders in the world. Well, listen, what's happening today, and Zelensky is a leader of free world today, it's obvious, and Ukrainian victory is going to be everybody's victory. And I think this example will inspire many people in America and in Europe to fight for democracy, for freedom. Because, you know, the West is lazy. Without the enemy and the end of the Cold War, they kind of lost those orientation points. And Ukraine is restoring those proper orientation points and the system of coordinates that for 30 years was lost. If we're looking at the situation from the point of view of common sense, and if they could look at it from the common sense point of view from the Kremlin, and they could see that their army is not accomplishing the mission, and they can see that their army is not the strongest in the world. Nevertheless, I don't see any signs that in Putin's head it actually clicked and he is changing his actions, that he is more inclined to make compromises. Why doesn't it happen? You see, you use the words common sense. You can't apply them to a dictator who is in power for 22 years. Our common sense is very different from what Putin has. And obviously, this common sense is in the heads of Russian generals, because at the latest briefing, we saw that they're trying to change their priorities, because they understand that these Napoleon plans of Putin to conquer Ukraine, those plans are failing. And today, they need to set up more feasible goals. Taking into account there is a lack of resources to support the whole military campaign across the territory of Ukraine. But it's also obvious that Putin uses a different logic. Common sense of dictator is to stay in power, but a defeat is the end of them. It's not only political, but a physical one. And Putin needs freedom. He can't accept defeat. He needs a victory, at least for the 9th of May, and he's throwing there all his resources. There is total mobilization in Russia. They bring troops from the Far East, from Georgia, from Armenia, from Tajikistan, and the Taliban is actually looking lustfully at Tajikistan because Russian borders are stripped away. And Russia is stripping away borders of all those countries who are part of the collective defense agreement. So, and those consequences of this war will be absolutely unpredictable, but Putin cannot lose. He needs a victory, and that's why I'm so skeptical about the negotiations that Russia and Ukraine are having today. Zelensky said that Ukraine may be ready to agree to get to the status quo of 24th of February, though without accepting any annexations, just to stop the war. But I think today it's hardly possible. But Putin wouldn't agree with that at all. His demands are not modified. He needs political victory, which will also have territorial annexations. That's why we have different logics. We have common sense logic, and we say that every human life is priceless, and any loss of life of anybody, of a soldier, of a civilian, this is a tragedy. But for Putin, it's statistics. Another 10,000 soldiers will die, whatever. And those two logics incompatible. And while Putin is in power, we will have no peace, because for him armistice is an opportunity to regroup. He sees Ukraine as impediment on the way of his geopolitical plans. That's why if he's not gonna succeed in this, he will try to use other chances. That's why I think that the only reasonable position for the West and for the world is a strategy to crush Putin's regime, and we can do it through Ukrainian victory and to have Ukrainian flag in Sevastopol. I was planning to talk to you longer, but I got a signal to finish our interview. Thank you very much for joining us and for your explanations. Thank you very much that you were with us and you support us. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to heroes.